With permission, Mr. Speaker, I want to make a statement on housing and building safety. Beyond the COVID-19 pandemic, the government wants to build back better. Better homes, better infrastructure, and better communities. But the foundations of these ambitions and the mission of my department are safety and fairness. We've all been moved by the stories we've heard and the people that we've met, homeowners, placed in difficult, sometimes impossible situations through no fault of their own. I appreciate the frustration, the worry, and at times the despair that they feel. I share their anger at the errors, the omissions, the false promises, and even the outright dishonesty that came before us, built up over many decades, but which this government is determined to tackle. That's why, Mr. Speaker, today I'm announcing an unprecedented intervention, a clear plan to remove unsafe cladding, to provide certainty to leaseholders, to make the industry pay for its faults of the past, to create a world-class building safety regime, and to inject confidence and certainty back into this part of the housing market. Firstly, we will finish the job that we've started on remediating unsafe cladding. After the tragedy of Grenfell Tower, the expert advice that this government received identified aluminium composite cladding, ACM, the material on the tower, as by far the most unsafe form of cladding. It should never have been used, and our independent expert advisory panel recommended that this should be the focus of our remediation work. Thanks to a very considerable effort, including during the pandemic, almost 95% of all high-rise buildings identified by the beginning of last year with unsafe ACM cladding have now been remediated, or workers are on site now doing the job, and that rises to 100% in social housing. And guided again by expert advice, the work to remove other types of cladding, which are also unsafe, albeit less so than ACM, where it poses a genuine risk to life, is also underway. It was always our expectation, our demand, that building owners and developers should step up to meet the cost of this work. Where they haven't, or where they no longer exist, the government has stepped in, providing £1.6 billion to remediate unsafe cladding. However, it's clear that without further government intervention, many building owners will simply seek to pass these potentially very significant costs on to leaseholders, as this is often the legal position in the leases that they signed. That would risk punishing those who've worked hard, who've bought their own home, but through no fault of their own have found themselves caught in an absolutely invidious situation. Importantly, it also risks slowing down the critical works to make these homes safer. I am therefore today making an exceptional intervention on behalf of the government and providing certainty that leaseholders in high-rise residential buildings will face no cost for cladding remediation works. We will make further funding available to pay for the removal and replacement of unsafe cladding for all leaseholders in high-rise residential buildings of 18 metres and above, or above 6 stories in England. We continue to take a safety-led approach, and this funding will focus on the higher-rise buildings where the independent expert advisory panel tells us, time and again, the overwhelming majority of the safety risk lies, in line with the existing Building Safety Fund and the anticipated scope of the new Building Safety Regulator that we're establishing and will shortly be legislating for. This will ensure that we end the cladding scandal in a way that is fair and generous to leaseholders. Secondly, for lower and medium-rise blocks of flats, the risks are significantly lower, and the remediation of cladding is less likely to be needed. In many cases, it will not be needed at all. But where it is, costs can still be significant for leaseholders, which is why I'm announcing today that the government will develop a long-term scheme to protect leaseholders in this situation with financial support for cladding remediation on buildings between 4 and 6 stories. Under a long-term, low-interest scheme, no leaseholder will ever pay more than £50 a month towards the removal of unsafe cladding, many far less. Taken together, this means the government is providing more than £5 billion, including a further £3.5 billion announced today, plus the significant cost of the very generous financing scheme, which will run for many years to come, to ensure all leaseholders in medium and high-rise blocks face no costs or very low costs if cladding remediation is needed. Where it is, costs can still be significant for leaseholders, which is why we want to take these important steps. We want to ensure that the government develops this long-term scheme which will protect leaseholders with financial support. Taken together, this means that the government helps leaseholders to move forwards with greater certainty and more confidence about the future. Thirdly, whilst the problem is not one of leaseholders making, it is also the case that it cannot be right that the costs of addressing these issues fall solely on taxpayers, many of whom are not themselves homeowners and can only dream of getting on the housing ladder. The government has always expected the industry to contribute towards these costs, and some have done so. Today, I'm announcing that we will introduce a Gateway to Developer levy that will be implemented through the forthcoming Building Safety Bill. The proposed levy will be targeted and only apply when developers seek permission to develop certain high-rise buildings in England, helping to ensure the industry take collective responsibility for historic building safety defects. In introducing the levy, we will continue to ensure the homes our country needs get built and that our small and medium-sized builders are protected. In addition, a new tax will be introduced for the UK residential property development sector in 2022. This will raise at least £2 billion over a decade to help pay for cladding remediation costs. The tax will ensure the largest property developers make a fair contribution to the remediation programme in relation to the money they make from residential property, reflecting the benefit that they will derive from restoring confidence to the UK housing market. The government will consult on the policy design in due course. Fourthly, I know there are many people across the country who are concerned about the safety of their home. In the actions we've taken and those that we take today, we've already prioritised very clearly public safety. However, it's also important that we put the risk of a fire, and in particular, the risk of a fatal fire, into context. It is low. Last year, the number of people who died in fires in blocks of flats over 11 metres was 10, an all-time low. And fire-related fatalities in dwellings in England have fallen by 29% over the last decade. By way of comparison, over 1,700 fatalities were reported on our roads in 2019. Now, of course, any death is one too many, and the tragedy of Grenfell Tower lingers with us and demands action. That's why it's right that we address safety issues where they exist and are a threat to life, but do so in a proportionate way and guided at all times by expert advice. That is the approach we're taking through the Building Safety Bill, the new building safety regulator, the Fire Safety Bill, and the new National Regulator of Construction Products that I announced in January. I'm determined that we have a world-class building safety regime. But lastly, we need everyone to follow this sensible, proportionate approach so that this part of the housing market can now move forwards and homeowners are not disproportionately impacted. The Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors have consulted on new guidance for valuers on when an EWS1 form should actually be required. The government endorses its work to ensure that assessors have a stronger basis on which to make good, proportionate judgments about valuation risk. Lenders have welcomed the progress on this guidance, which will help ensure that over 500,000 leaseholders in blocks of flats over 11 metres will not need a separate EWS1 assessment to get a mortgage. This builds on the interventions that we've already made to create and train many more assessors, and we're doing so further so that they can access professional indemnity insurance to get on with the job. So today, in addition to providing certainty to leaseholders, we're also providing confidence to lenders. And following discussions my right honourable friend the Chancellor and I have had with the lenders, we expect all of the major banks and building societies to strongly support today's intervention, which will provide greater certainty to the market and help to restore the effective lending, purchasing and selling of properties as soon as possible. Taken together, Mr. Speaker, this exceptional intervention amounts to the largest ever government investment in building safety. We believe in home ownership, and today we firmly support the hundreds of thousands of homeowners who need our help now. I commend this statement to the House.
I will call Thangam Debbonaire, who is participating virtually, who has 6 minutes in which to respond. Thangam Debbonaire.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Secretary of State for advance sight of his statement. Buying your first home should be a dream come true, but for many it's now been a nightmare for years. As a result of government choices, 3.5 years on from the Grenfell tragedy in which 72 people lost their lives, hundreds of thousands of people are still trapped in unsafe homes, many more unable to move. And today's announcement is too late for too many. It's a repeat of undelivered promises and backtracks on the key one that leaseholders should have no costs to pay. The Chancellor said last March, all unsafe combustible cladding will be removed from every private and social residential building above 18 metres high, but that has not happened. Buildings haven't been able to access the fund, and £9 out of 10 is still sitting where it was. At every stage, the government underestimated the problem and delays caused it to grow. They still don't know how many buildings are unsafe, where they are, or what danger they pose. And until we have answers to those basic questions, government will continue to make mistakes, offering piecemeal solutions that then have to be updated when they don't deliver. So I ask, can the Secretary of State guarantee the funding will cover all buildings over 18 metres? What will the consequential be for the devolved administrations, including Wales? We can't have a repeat of the first come, first served free-for-all, where the most dangerous blocks risk being fixed last. So will the government set up an independent task force, as Labour has asked for, to prioritise buildings according to risk, have powers to get the funds out of the door and to be able to go after the building owners who fail to get on with the work? Government ministers have now promised 17 times that leaseholders will not bear the cost of fixing a problem they didn't cause. Many will be listening to the Housing Secretary's remarks today, and the government has betrayed their promise that leaseholders wouldn't pay for the building safety crisis. As I said, 3.5 years on from Grenfell, hundreds of thousands can't sleep at night because their homes are unsafe. The government has chosen today to pile financial misery on them. This is an injustice. What does the Housing Secretary say to Julie in Runcorn, who lives in a flat with dangerous HPL cladding? Her block is under 18 metres, so she's unable to access funding promised so far. She lives in the same development as buildings with the exact same cladding, but over 18 metres, so they will be able to access the fund. Why should this arbitrary 18-metre height limit mean the difference between a safe home and financial ruin? What are the terms of the loans? What will the interest rate be? And will leaseholders be required to pay the interest as well as the main cost? And he says leaseholders won't pay more than £50 a month. Does that stay with the current owners when they move, or with the home if the new owner is forced to pay? How long does it run for? Will it go up by inflation each year? And what will government do if those homes remain unsellable? How will they ensure that freeholders take up the loans? How will government speed up remediation? Because the current stalemate cannot continue. And then there are others who don't have dangerous cladding but have been charged hundreds of thousands of pounds, thousands of pounds per flat to fix other fire safety issues. What does the Housing Secretary say to them? The government should focus on securing our economy and rebuilding from COVID, not saddling homeowners with further debt. When they have further debt, that means less money for our economic recovery, taking money away from local shops. It reinforces regional imbalances, and it makes young first-time buyers and pensioners pay money they can't afford. The government should pursue those responsible fully to prevent leaseholders and taxpayers from carrying the can. The government has announced a levy and a tax, which I welcome because those responsible should bear the cost. But how much does the government anticipate this levy will raise? And will the government pursue others, such as cladding manufacturers, also responsible for putting the dangerous cladding? Government has missed every target for removing ACM cladding, and there are still 50,000 people living in flats wrapped in it. The same cladding as found on Grenfell Tower, thousands more with other dangerous cladding. So will the Minister commit today to remove all dangerous cladding by 2022? As the Secretary of State will know, at least one first-time homeowner, Hayley, has already been made bankrupt before she was even asked to pay for remediation, just from the extra costs. She asked government to think about her former neighbours. When will leaseholders start receiving funding to pay for the round-the-clock fire patrols they've been charged hundreds of pounds each month for? What about the skyrocketing insurance? And how will government get the market moving? And their last announcement fell to pieces. The housing market in affected homes is grinding to a halt. And a simple question, what on average does he expect the leaseholder to be paying? Mr. Speaker, finally, government inaction and delay has caused the building safety crisis to spiral. People cannot continue to live in unsafe, unsellable homes. Homeowners shouldn't face bankruptcy to fix a problem they didn't cause. Unfortunately, these proposals will still leave too many people struggling and facing loans instead of being given justice. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased that the Honourable Lady welcomes many of the proposals we've set out today. This is an unprecedented intervention, and it's one of the most generous, if not the most generous of its kind, anywhere in the world. She asks, importantly, why have we focused on high-rise buildings? Because that is time and again where all the independent expert advice leads us. We must make these judgments on the basis of expert advice. With the greatest respect to the Honourable Lady, I think we need to follow the expert advisors, not her own instincts. We're focusing on the buildings over 18 metres where the work needs to get done, and in those buildings, we're ensuring that the leaseholder never pays. We want the building owners to step up and meet the cost, but where that's not possible, and in many cases I'm afraid it isn't because the building owners are no longer around, in those situations the taxpayer will step in and meet the cost with the advantage of the levy and the tax to come to help recoup the costs. That must be the right approach. She asks whether enough progress has been made. Well, actually, we've ended 2020 with 95% of buildings over 18 metres with the most dangerous form of cladding, ACM cladding, either having been remediated or the workers are on site doing the job. And that's 100% of the buildings in the social sector. And that's a huge step forward. And I pay tribute to everyone who's been part of that over the course of the year, including keeping the works going during the pandemic, which many politicians, I have to say, including Labour politicians, asked us not to do. That was the wrong judgment, but we kept those works going. For lower-rise buildings, those of 4 to 6 stories, then we're bringing into play this important new financing scheme. And that means that those leaseholders who have, at the moment, impossible costs, providing great worry and strain, will now be able to have the reassurance that those costs are turned into manageable ones, and they will never need to pay more than £50 a month, and many will pay far less, and only where the cladding really does need to come off to make sure that the building is safe. That will provide peace of mind to hundreds of thousands of leaseholders, and I think can be seen as a generous, affordable way forward for the taxpayer. You have to remember that when the Prime Minister and I came to office 18 months ago, there was only £200 million of government money available to support leaseholders in this situation. And that in itself was the result of incredibly hard work by my predecessor, the Right Honourable Member for Bexley and Sidcup. Today, 18 months later, there are many, many billions of pounds of support in direct government grant and then billions more, no doubt, in financing scheme funding available to support those leaseholders and to get the situation under control. Meanwhile, what is happening in other parts of the country? Well, we know that in Scotland, according to a recent FOI request, the Scottish Government have done absolutely nothing. The funding that they received from the Building Safety Fund is sat in a bank account in Edinburgh, and they've done nothing with it. I'd be interested to know from the Honourable Lady what the Welsh Government is doing. I don't know. Perhaps she can inform us. And the Honourable Lady herself came to this late. It was only a week or so ago that she convened the first debate on this in her tenure. She didn't offer a plan. She didn't show an appreciation of the scale and the complexity of the issue. She offered a task force, a committee. Empty words, I'm afraid, and gestures. That's not good enough. While she was doing that, the Prime Minister, my right honourable friend the Chancellor, and I were working with the lenders, the insurers, the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors, and the leaseholder groups to bring forward what we've announced today, which I hope all fair-minded members across the House will see as a very significant intervention, which does get unsafe cladding off buildings and end the cladding scandal. It does provide reassurance and confidence to leaseholders. It does ensure that the developers and the industry pay their fair share. It does build a world-class building safety regime. And it does enable us now to move forwards, to reopen and restore confidence in the housing market so the country can move forward again.
Let's head to West Sussex with Sir Peter Bottomley. Sir Peter.
Speaker, can I first say I'm a leaseholder neither affected by the problem nor gaining by the solution. Can I say to my right honourable friend, we recognise this is another set of major steps along the way during the last 3 years. The problems were spelt out by the all-party group, and I pay tribute to the honourable member for Ellesmere Port and Neston for working together in a cross-party way. There will be more to do, and the Select Committee will no doubt have hearings. I want to ask my right honourable friend if you'll first of all thank the Chancellor and the Prime Minister for helping to make the funding available. I won't claim it's going to be enough, but it's a major step forward, and I recognise that. There's the problem about low-rise in low-income areas who may look at high-rise and high-income areas getting more direct help. Can he talk about that? And can he say that no leaseholder who doesn't actually own anything will have to sign away any of their rights to eventual compensation as and when the inquiry finishes and any civil claims of liability against developers, manufacturers, local building control or national regulators come to be finalised? Thank you.
Well, can I praise my honourable friend for his determined campaigning on this issue, which I think everybody in this House has recognised over many years and for which many leaseholders will no doubt be grateful. I've been pleased to work with him and to take his advice when it's been needed. I can assure him that the funding that we've made available today will provide leaseholders with the certainty and confidence that they need. That any leaseholder in a building over 80 metres will now know that they will not have to pay for the removal of cladding. And those leaseholders in the buildings that are lower rise those of 11 to 18 metres, can have great comfort from the fact that this new financing arrangement will be in place. It doesn't preclude any actions by the building or by the leaseholders against insurers or those holding warranties, the developers, and those actions should take place. We want to see those who made these mistakes brought to book. We don't want this all to fall upon the taxpayer. That's absolutely essential, because this is a very difficult judgment. We have to balance the interests of leaseholders, who are homeowners, with those of the broader taxpayer as well, and ensure that we're striking the right balance. I think we've done that today, and I hope this is a major step forward in the battle against this issue.
I now head to SNP spokesperson Patricia Gibson, who's participating virtually with 3 minutes. Patricia Gibson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This announcement today of an additional £3.5 billion is encouraging as far as it goes, and I'm sure the Scottish Government looks forward to the consequentials arising from this announcement. And what the Secretary of State has said today will offer some relief to homeowners affected by cladding issues, many of whom are already struggling with bills and simply don't feel able to take on more debt, as their dream homes have become a nightmare with mortgage ratings of 0 due to unsafe cladding. The consequences, as he knows, have been far-reaching for those caught up in this scandal, with homes currently worth nothing, which cannot be sold and which residents feel unsafe. I very much welcome the responsibility for cladding being borne, in part at least, by the larger players in the industry, but more details as to how that works is needed. However, despite what the Secretary of State has said, that no leaseholder will ever pay more than £50 per month in paying back loans to remove this cladding, I'm sure he will understand this will still be disappointing for many, since through no fault of their own, they are still facing additional costs after buying their homes in good faith and face debt which they don't want and which will impact on household incomes during these difficult times. Much more detail on exactly how these low interest loans will work is needed. But can the Secretary of State confirm that there will be an upper limit to these additional costs for leaseholders, or is the £50 cap only a monthly cap? He will appreciate that this matters because building work so often overruns. And what time frame within which does he expect this remediation work to be completed?
Well, I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady for welcoming much of the substance of the announcement today. I would draw her back to the remarks I made earlier, which is that, to the best of my knowledge, the Scottish Government have made no use at all of the funding they've been provided through the existing Building Safety Fund. And so I think important questions now need to be answered by her government in Scotland as to what is actually happening there. What are they doing to support leaseholders? How are they making those buildings safe? With respect to the financing scheme that we're bringing forwards in England, it will be a matter for the Scottish Government, or indeed the Welsh or Northern Irish administrations, to decide whether they wish to create a similar scheme. We have set this upper limit of £50 a month. So this does provide a great deal of comfort to leaseholders that they'll never need to pay more than that per month. And that's about the equivalent of the average service charge for a purpose-built block of flats. I appreciate that this is a cost that no one would wish to bear, but I think it is a reasonable one in balancing the interests of the taxpayer with providing support and protection to the leaseholder. We'll be bringing forward further details on how that scheme works as quickly as we can. I think it's important also to say that the arrangement that we'll be creating is not a loan to an individual. This is a financing scheme with buildings. The loans do not sit with the individual. They won't affect their credit rating. These are loans on a long tenure that will remain with the building and will ensure that the leaseholders themselves can move on with their lives.
We now come to Felicity Buchan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, I would like to thank the Secretary of State for working so closely with me on cladding issues over the course of the last 15 months. I have been calling for a substantial and comprehensive package for cladding remediation. So I warmly welcome this announcement, which very importantly allows funds to be deployed very quickly and does not require task forces or legislation. Now, I have called for a package of £5 to £10 billion, very quickly trying to tot up all of the numbers as you went through the details. I think this could be approaching certainly the middle, if not the upper end of that range. Can my right honourable friend confirm that and also assure me that money will be deployed as quickly as possible? Thank you.
Well, can I praise my honourable friend, who has been a fantastic Member of Parliament for Kensington since she was elected, and has raised this and other issues arising out of the Grenfell tragedy almost every week with me. In fact, we do meet every week to discuss these issues. She's right to say this is a very substantial intervention. We've already made £1.6 billion available, and we estimate that it will require another £3.5 billion to complete the remediation of unsafe cladding on buildings over 18 metres and to make good on the promise that we've made today to those leaseholders. In addition to that, we'll be bringing forward the financing scheme, and as I've said, the details of that will be published shortly, but it is a very generous scheme, and there is a significant cost to the taxpayer of ensuring the £50 cap gives that added level of protection and reassurance to leaseholders. So the total intervention that we're making today is, as she says, one of many, many billions of pounds. That's a difficult judgment, which the Prime Minister and the Chancellor have made with me, but we do believe this is a fair and generous settlement to help everybody move forwards.
We now head to the Chair of the Select Committee, Clive Betts in Sheffield. Clive.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On behalf of the Select Committee, could I thank the Secretary of State for his statement and welcome it as far as it goes, because in terms of the Select Committee recommendations, it does, of course, only go so far. So I'd like to invite the Secretary of State to come back to the Select Committee to discuss this issue in more detail shortly after the recess. Immediately, will he confirm that as a result of the loan scheme, no leaseholder will be placed in negative equity? Secondly, in terms of the additional costs, non-cladding costs to deal with building safety, has he done any assessment of the impact of those costs, the total amount of those costs that will fall on leaseholders? And finally, will he confirm that there is no help in this statement for councils and housing associations, and as a result, to carry out essential safety work, they're going to have to put up rents, cut maintenance, or cut the number of affordable homes they can build?
Well, can I thank the honourable gentleman and the members of the Select Committee for their expert advice on this issue over a number of years, and to me personally as Secretary of State. Of course, I'd be delighted to come before his committee and discuss this further in the near future. When he says that this doesn't go as far as he would have liked, I appreciate that sentiment, and no doubt there will be leaseholders watching today who would wish us to go even further. But this is a very significant intervention. We do have to keep coming back to that. English property rights, very broadly speaking, are based on caveat emptor, buyer beware, and the contents of the leases, the contracts, the warranties, the insurance policies that we as homeowners sign. What we're doing today is stepping in a way that governments haven't done in the past, that they haven't done when people's homes have been flooded or subject to subsidence or other unforeseen and incredibly difficult and challenging issues. We've chosen to do this because we have immense sympathy for the leaseholders affected, and as a matter of basic public safety, we have to get this unsafe materials off buildings as quickly as possible. And so I think this is the right judgment and the right balance to be struck between the interests of the leaseholder and those of the broader taxpayer. But I'd be delighted to come before his committee and discuss this in more detail soon.
Let's head to Burton with Kate Griffiths. Kate Griffiths.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the measures that my right honourable friend has set out today. But can I urge him to review the long-term issues here? Profitability should not come before safety. Will my right honourable friend look into the issues that I hear about regularly of new build properties not being built to high enough standards, leaving homeowners spending months chasing developers to come back and fix problems with their homes.
I entirely agree with the Honourable Lady. We all believe in home ownership. We want to get more people onto the housing ladder, and we know that owning a home of your own is one of the most special achievements in life. But we also know that in recent years, some of our developers, and some of our most prominent ones too, have built homes which are to a poor standard. They have admitted it in some cases. And we need to make sure that that's corrected so that the quality of homes in this country is high and that members of the public can have confidence making that life-changing investment. It cannot be right that buying a home affords you less protection than buying a mobile phone or many other things we do in our daily lives. We want to see a major change in the culture of the industry so that homeowners get the product, the brilliant, beautiful, high-quality home that they deserve. We've set up a new homes ombudsman, and that's going to be passed into law as part of the Building Safety Regulator. And the new regulatory regime, which is already in existence in shadow form, will be put into permanent form through the passing of that bill. For higher-rise buildings, those over 18 metres, that will create a very strict, world-class regulatory regime.
Let's head to West Ham with Lynn Brown. Lynn Brown.
Agree with everything the Honourable Member for Bristol West said, with knobs on. My constituents won't be reassured by what they've heard. Loans for leaseholders still ain't off the table. He's avoided talking about non-cladding costs, and there's still no guarantee my constituents won't be left with large associated bills for problems they didn't create. And a number of institutions are frankly profiteering from this crisis, including parts of the insurance industry and others. Eye-watering premiums. Why are we still waiting for this Secretary of State to get a grip on this crisis?
Well, I'm disappointed by the tone of the Honourable Lady's remarks. She has actually followed this issue very closely and has fought for her constituents, and I praise her, recognise her for that hard work. But this government has done a huge amount, and I entirely reject her accusations. We have brought forward the public inquiry. We've planned and are now legislating for a new building safety regulator, a world-class regulatory regime. We've brought in people to ensure that the unsafe cladding on ACM-clad high-rise buildings is remediated, and that work has progressed a great deal over the course of the year. As I said earlier, many Labour politicians, including the Mayor of London, opposed that initially at the height of the pandemic. So we've done a great deal, but there's more to be done. I don't know what her proposition is with respect to other materials beyond cladding. All the expert opinion says focus on cladding. That is the primary risk here. That is the focus that government should have. I will keep following expert advice. If the Labour Party's position is that we shouldn't follow that, and that in fact the Chancellor should write a blank cheque and say that absolutely any building safety defect on any building of any height should be paid for by the taxpayer, then that is a cost, a very, very substantial cost, and I'd be interested to know how she intends to fund that. With respect to the insurance companies, I do now expect them to step up and ensure that their premiums are proportionate and risk-based, because I think some of them have been exploiting leaseholders in a very difficult position.
Right, let's head to the West Midlands with Shaun Bailey. Shaun Bailey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I start by welcoming my right honourable friend's statement today? It was clearly the right one. But can I ask my right honourable friend, he touched on it in one of his responses earlier, clearly what leaseholders are ultimately going to care about is making sure this remediation is done. So can I ask him what work he is undertaking with SMEs, particularly, for example, like Baylis Roof and Cladding in Tipton, to ensure that they can actually get this work done and leaseholders can finally be freed of this dangerous cladding and the impact that it has on their status as homeowners?
Well, the approach that I took when I became Secretary of State was to set a target for us that we would either remediate all buildings or get the workers on site by the end of last year. And as I say, with a few exceptions, largely because of the COVID-19 pandemic, we achieved that. We've used project managers and consultants to ensure that every single building in that cohort is being individually managed. And myself and my ministers have been meeting with the contractors, the leaders of local councils, the chief executives, the residents' management associations of those buildings regularly to ensure the progress is happening. That work needs to continue and needs to broaden out now to all those buildings that will benefit from today's announcement. He's also right to say that today's announcement will create certainty and confidence for the broader construction sector to come forward and enter the market to do this work. That will create thousands of jobs, and I would encourage businesses, large and small, to take part in this major initiative.
Head up to Bedfordshire with Rachel Hopkins. Rachel Hopkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased the Secretary of State wants to tackle rising insurance premiums, but I've also spoken to many leaseholders in my constituency of Luton South who have faced additional costs around other interim safety measures such as Waking Watch and also in fixing other fire safety issues, which the Secretary of State seemed to push back on. These joined up financial pressures are pushing many leaseholders near to bankruptcy. So what is the government doing to help bring down these costs?
Well, we are working with the insurance sector, and I think they do now need to take a more proportionate risk-based approach. Some of the examples, they might be outliers, but the examples I've heard of insurance premiums rising by 1,000% are completely out of kilter with the statistics that I gave earlier, that only 10 people last year tragically died in buildings over 11 metres, and only 41 people died in any house fire in this country at all. With respect to Waking Watch, I think that is a very challenging issue, but we have brought forward our £30 million fund to replace Waking Watches with high-quality, effective fire alarm systems. That fund is now open, and I'd encourage any building, perhaps including the one in the Honourable Lady's constituency, to apply for it, get the fire alarm installed, and then hopefully reduce those costs quickly.
On Sir David Avenant. Sir David.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome my right honourable friend's statement and know there will be many people in my constituency and across the country who will be relieved that the government is taking further action on this issue of unsafe cladding. Does he agree with me that speed is of the essence, and could he confirm that the additional financial remediation will help relieve the worry and will remove unfair and unfounded costs on leaseholders to deal with the removal of unsafe cladding?
I certainly can, and I thank the Honourable Gentleman, my right honourable friend, for the work that he's done on behalf of his constituents. I know we've corresponded on this subject many times. Today's announcement will provide comfort and reassurance to hundreds of thousands of leaseholders, and I'd also draw his attention and that of the House to the work that we're doing with RICS, which will ensure that around 50% of those individuals who might have required an EWS1 form now to no longer need to go through that laborious and often expensive process.
We now head to St Albans with Daisy Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When there was a failure of regulation in the city, the government bailed out the banks in a matter of days to the tune of £500 billion. In the face of a failure of fire safety regulation, when people are terrified of burning to death in their homes, the government has taken 3.5 years and only offered 6. Some of my constituents are still facing the cost of non-cladding fire safety problems, waking watches and more. So when will the government accept the basic principle that cladding victims should not have to pay a penny to fix fire safety problems that are not of their making?
Well, actually, the government acted decisively in the immediate aftermath of Grenfell Tower. Expert opinion has evolved over time. The first expert advice the government received was, as I said earlier, to focus on ACM cladding, the cladding that's on the Grenfell Tower, and to focus on those buildings over 18 metres. We put in place the funding to do that, where the building owners and the industry weren't able or wouldn't pay themselves. The expert advice then said that there were some other materials which were somewhat less unsafe, but nonetheless still could be unsafe. And that work is underway, and the Chancellor gave an extra £1 billion at the budget a year ago to do that. And then we brought forward this very, very substantial intervention today. So we're working intensively and extensively to tackle the issue, and I hope today's intervention will be a permanent and lasting settlement.
Let's head to the North West with Andy Carter. Andy Carter.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And can I also thank the Secretary of State for his statement today in relation to building safety. Warrington doesn't have any apartments above 18 metres, which would require remediation. But I have heard from a number of parents concerned that their sons and daughters are paying additional charges levied by landlords to cover the cost of insurance and waking watches in apartments that they've purchased. wonder if my right honourable friend can set out what steps the government are taking to cover these costs so that the burden doesn't fall on families of my constituents.
Well, the announcement that we've made today and the work that my right honourable friend and I, the Chancellor and I, have done with each of the major retail banks who strongly support this intervention does give much greater confidence to lenders, to surveyors and to insurers to re-enter the market, to bring down those premiums, to lend against these buildings and enable the market to move forwards again. This will take time. There is more to be done. But I think you will see the market now moving forward in a way that it hasn't done in recent months.
Let's head north to Dame Diana Johnson. Dame Diana.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State has referred to fairness and the need for building companies to step up. And I understand that he is introducing a levy on those companies. But what more is he doing to pursue those responsible for building unsafe homes, leaving the taxpayers and leaseholders to meet the clean-up costs?
Well, the Honourable Lady raised an extremely important point, and let me be absolutely clear. The first thing that the government has done is establish the independent Grenfell inquiry. That has already heard some absolutely shocking allegations of malpractice and, in fact, outright dishonesty amongst some of the construction products manufacturers. It will be a matter for the police whether they choose to take forward criminal prosecutions against individuals or companies involved. In terms of remediation, we want the building owners to pay. Some have, and I'm grateful for that. In fact, some of the large volume house builders, even today, have come forward saying that they will pay more. That needs to continue, and nothing that I've said today should take away from that. They should still come forward, as well as paying their fair share through the levy and the tax that I've announced today.
Let's head up to Lancashire with Mark Menzies. Mark.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank my right honourable friend for making this significant intervention? But will he assure me that the industry responsible, which includes some of the wealthiest individuals and organisations in the land, will be paying its fair share when taxpayers, many of whom are not homeowners, are already being hit hard enough?
The levy and the tax that I have announced today and that my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, and I will be setting out more details on, ensure that the industry pays its fair share, in addition to them stepping up and paying for the remediation of buildings for which they've got responsibility. It has to be said that there's no simple solution to this. Many of the builders and developers who constructed these buildings are long gone. They've gone into administration. They're shell companies offshore. This is not a simple challenge to fix, as some have suggested. But I hope the measures we've taken today will go a long way.
Let's head to Dame Margaret Hodge. Dame Margaret.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A number of members have said that getting any money out of government has proved painfully slow. So leaseholders today are facing extra costs for insurance whilst their buildings remain unsafe. Building insurance at the ropeworks in Barking rocketed from 70,000 to 650,000. That's a 900% hike in just 2 years. Now, the ABI has told me that ministers have refused to engage to find an urgent, practical way forward now. Will the minister assure us today that the government will immediately engage with all insurers, take on some of that short-term risk so that leaseholders can buy affordable cover until their buildings are made safe?
Well, can I pay tribute to the Honourable Lady for the work that she's done, and she and I have worked together since the terrible fire that her constituents suffered in Barking. She's right to raise the issue of insurance, as other members of the House have done already. There is a challenge here because, as with the lenders, the insurers are faced with assessing a new and heightened level of risk. But I do think that the Association of British Insurers now needs to step up and take a proportionate risk-based approach. As I've said repeatedly, the risk to life in buildings is actually very low, mercifully, with the tragic exception of the events of 2017. And so insurers should be pricing that risk correctly and not passing on those costs or even profiteering on the backs of the leaseholders. We have engaged repeatedly with the insurers, both myself and my honourable friend, the noble Lord Greenhouse, who leads on building safety, and we will do so again.
We now go to Andrew Selous. Thank you very much, Madam Deputy. Significant intervention and the relief that it will bring to so many people. And does the Secretary of State agree with me that we've established a very important principle today, that if developers ever behave in this type of manner again, the government will come after them and not the hard-pressed taxpayer to put these issues right?
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right. We all feel immense sympathy for the leaseholder. They are innocent parties in this situation. But it also isn't right that the taxpayer, the broader taxpayer, many of whom are not homeowners at all, has to step in and foot the bill. So we've tried to strike a balance today, and we've tried to ensure that the developers, the builders, the industry behind this pays a fair share. In the Building Safety Bill that we'll be bringing forward later this year, we'll bring forward a very tight regulatory regime so that buildings, those over 18 metres, the high-rise buildings, are built to a very high standard, and these issues should not happen again.
Deputy Speaker, leaseholders in Hornsey and Wood Green have been trapped for the third lockdown in a terrible situation with building defects, unsure when they can lend, when they can get a mortgage to move on in their property. One said, "I'm at my wit's end with a small newborn baby." So I hope that today will bring her some succour. But what about councils and what about housing associations, which after 10 years of austerity simply do not have the money to be able to give much relief to desperate leaseholders? Has he got any good news for those leaseholders?
Yes, well, the Honourable Lady raises an important point. We have been working very closely with local authorities since the start of this issue in the immediate aftermath of the Grenfell tragedy, and I've engaged repeatedly with the National Housing Federation, who've done excellent work in this regard. We did provide funding to help support them, and we're focusing the funding that we've provided on those housing associations or local councils who cannot fund this themselves, either through their own reserves or their ability to borrow. Most housing associations can do that. There will be a small number who can't. Of course, there are choices at every turn in this, and that in itself will have consequences and make it harder for those housing associations to invest in more affordable and social housing or other important aims that they and I share, like making those buildings more energy efficient to meet our climate obligations as well. That's the difficult situation that we find ourselves in. The other thing I would just say to the Honourable Lady is I'm acutely aware of the challenges faced by shared owners, and we're going to make particular provision to protect them so that they don't have to meet disproportionate costs with respect to cladding remediation.
18 withdrawn, so we go to Ellie Reeves.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In my constituency, I have a number of buildings that are below 18 metres. Today's announcement means leaseholders... Speaker, in my constituency, I have a number of buildings that are below 18 metres. Today's announcement means leaseholders of these buildings will still need to foot the bill. My constituents who were promised leaseholders wouldn't have to pay for a crisis they didn't cause.
Well, let me be clear on this point once again. The expert advice is very clear. That says that we should focus our attention on the buildings where there is a higher risk. Those are buildings over 18 metres, and so it's right that government chooses to do that when it's using such large sums of taxpayer money. For those buildings between 11 and 18 metres, between approximately 4 and 6 storeys, then we are bringing forward this financing scheme, which will enable leaseholders to move forward with confidence and certainty in the knowledge that they'll never need to pay more than £50 a month to meet the cladding remediation, where that absolutely needs to be done. And I do go back to the point I've tried to make repeatedly, that in many, many cases it will not need to be done because we want surveyors and the industry to take a proportionate risk-based approach which takes true account of the risk to life in those properties, which for most leaseholders, mercifully, is very low.
We now go to Caroline Ansell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Too many people in Eastbourne have suffered the stress and the strain of looming costs, and today there will be some relief at the announcement that my right honourable friend has made. It is a significant intervention, and I look forward to seeing the details on that. It also recognises fairness, and it recognises balance, and I welcome that also. Can I ask, although we are of course today focusing on cladding, can I ask what further work there will be done to help those leaseholders who are now facing costs around fire safety defects also exposed in the wake of the Grenfell tragedy, not cladding, but fire breaks, fire doors, and those very necessary works, which themselves can be very costly too.
Well, the Honourable Lady has championed her constituents in this regard, and she and I have discussed this in the past. I hope the announcement will provide comfort to some of the constituents that I'm aware of in Eastbourne. One building in particular that I think we've corresponded on is above 18 metres, and so will certainly be a beneficiary of this scheme if it hasn't been of previous ones. She's right to raise the fact that there are other building safety defects which have come to light, and we have spoken about those in the past, whether that's fire blocks, insulation or fire doors, and some of those works will need to be done. That needs to be done on a proportionate risk-based approach, only where there is a true risk to life, so that the bill for leaseholders is not disproportionate. We also, of course, want to see the building owners step up and pay for those works. Where there's been poor workmanship, the building owner needs to take responsibility, and we will continue to do everything we can to support leaseholders to pursue those claims.
We now go to Janet Davey.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the intervention this afternoon and the Secretary of State's acknowledgement of the despair and sheer anger that people and families experience since they've been living in unsafe homes due to unsafe cladding. However, I put it to the Secretary of State that what my constituents will want to hear is clear timescales for this remedial work, as it has now been nearly 4 years since so many lives were lost in the Grenfell fire. Leaseholders need reassurance that they will not need to wait another 4 years. Please also explain why leaseholders should be made to pay hidden costs or otherwise for a problem they did not cause. Is this the best the government can do, and is this what the government considers to be fair?
Well, I do think this is a fair intervention. It's the largest of its type I think any government in this country has ever made. It is a balance between the interests of the leaseholders and those of the broader taxpayer, as I've already said. In terms of wider building safety defects, as I said in answer to the Honourable Lady for Eastbourne, we'll do everything we can to support leaseholders to pursue action against those people who made those errors and omissions in the past. And I share the anger of leaseholders of the mistakes that have been made, both those by industry and by regulators who came before us. What we must do now as a government is move forward, make sure this never happens again, and support leaseholders as much as we practically can do. And that's exactly what we intend to do.
Sir Edward Lee.
May I once again say a word on behalf of a group of people who hardly ever gets a mention in this chamber, namely the poor, benighted general taxpayer. Barely a single one of my 75,000 constituents lives in a house or block of flats over 4 stories high. Yet living in poor rural areas, once again, they are being asked to bail out, in this case, greedy developers in rich, wealthy areas. So can we have a balance? And before I finish, can I just ask about Lincoln University, which has been forced to reclad one of its residences, and what discussions he's had with the universities and his education colleague on this issue?
Well, on the important second point that he raises, we have worked with both the Department for Education and the Department for Health on buildings within the wider public sector, universities, student halls of residences, and in a small number of cases, buildings within the NHS to ensure that the works proceed at pace there, and I'll happily update him with respect to Lincoln University. The first point he makes is actually an extremely important one. We've had to strike a careful balance here, because there are millions of our fellow citizens in this country who are not homeowners, and we have to protect their interests just as we want to provide safety and fairness for the leaseholder. That's the balance we've tried to strike today, and I hope that fair-minded people across the House and in the country will appreciate that and understand the choices we've made.
We now go to Florence Eshalomi.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome today's announcement, and this is a testament to the campaigning of leaseholders across the country. I'm sure the Secretary of State believes that the deal he's negotiated with the Treasury is a great success, but for many of my constituents in Vauxhall, this will not make any or little material difference. A number of leaseholders continue to pay thousands of pounds for interim safety measures. And Madam Deputy Speaker, the issue at hand today is one of principle and fairness. And the upshot for many constituents is that they are still paying despite the government's assurances. So if the government subscribes to the principle that no leaseholder should have to pay for the fire safety problems, can the Secretary of State please explain why this package clearly shows that not all leaseholders are treated equally?
Well, the Honourable Lady is wrong. There will be thousands of her constituents who will directly benefit from today's announcement. We've chosen rightly, on the basis of expert advice, to prioritise buildings over 18 metres. That is where the greatest risk is. It would be quite wrong for us to direct public money, taxpayers' money, to buildings where the risk is low or extremely remote. So we're targeting it on the buildings that need it the most. And in those buildings, leaseholders can have certainty that they will not be paying for the remediation of unsafe cladding. It will either be paid by the building owner, the developer, which is quite right, or it will be paid for by the taxpayer, and we'll be using the levy and the new tax to recoup as much as that as we possibly can. And in the other buildings, those where the risk is significantly lower, we will be ensuring the new financing arrangement gives real comfort to people that they'll never need to pay more than £50 a month. And my expectation is that many of them will pay significantly less than that. So I think to most reasonable people, that will be a sum of money which is truly affordable and manageable within the budget of most homeowners.
We now go to Lee Anderson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I want to thank the Secretary of State for all his hard work on this, and I welcome what he has announced today. But could I ask my right honourable friend what the Scottish and Welsh governments are doing to improve building safety?
I honestly don't know. The Scottish Government have, as far as I'm aware, done nothing with the very significant sum of money that the Chancellor gave them previously through the Barnett Consequentials process. I'm not aware of what the Welsh Government is doing. I think those are questions that are better directed to the Scottish Government and to the Welsh Labour administration.
We now go to Neil Coyle.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Secretary of State said that his mission is the safety and fairness of leaseholders. How then do today's proposals protect a leaseholder who's been paying £50 a month, but at the point of sale still has a large loan outstanding on their home due to the cost of removing unsafe cladding? Isn't the truth that he's failed to deliver on promises of fairness and he's choosing to leave thousands of leaseholders facing massive costs?
The honourable gentleman, for whom I've got great respect, but he misunderstands the scheme that we've just announced. For those buildings between 4 and 6 storeys, where the risk is much lower, leaseholders will have the opportunity, if they wish to, with no compulsion, the opportunity to take advantage of the financing scheme. That loan scheme financing arrangement will sit with the building. It will not sit with the individual. It won't affect their own personal credit rating, and it shouldn't have a material impact upon the value of their property. It will be akin to paying somewhat more on your service charge every month. And as I say, it will be capped at £50 a month, which is akin to the average service charge. And of course, many buildings pay service charges far in excess of that already.
Now go to Sir Geoffrey Clifton-Brown.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In drawing the House's attention to my register of interest, can I say to my right honourable friend, I think this is one of the most generous and innovative schemes anywhere. Can I ask him particularly about those buildings to where the finance loan scheme is applicable and whether it will be applicable to non-cladding costs, but nevertheless have a material health and safety element in them, for example, fire doors and asbestos?
Well, we've chosen to focus both the grant scheme and the financing arrangements on cladding. That's, I think, for good reason, because the expert advice that we've received from the independent panel consistently says that cladding is the greatest danger that needs to be combated. There may be other defects in buildings. They will vary widely, building to building, and those will have to be a matter for the building owner and for the homeowners. But we, as a government, are going to tackle the big issue here, which is cladding, and end the cladding scandal that began with the Grenfell Tower tragedy.
Now go to Justin Madders.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the funding announced as a step in the right direction, but unfortunately, it's only likely to cover around half the anticipated costs, and it is the innocent leaseholder who will be picking up the bill for the other half. The Secretary of State has said he has sympathy for leaseholders, but that sympathy doesn't appear to extend below 18 metres and directly contradicts the promise repeatedly made that no leaseholder would have to pay anything. I deeply regret the government's decision to break that promise and create another injustice. So can the Secretary of State say how many leaseholders he now estimates will be subject to the loan scheme that he has announced today?
We don't want any leaseholder to be paying for fire safety defects. We want that to be paid for by the building owners, the developers, the builders, the people who did this in the first place. Where that's not possible, and as I said before, there are circumstances where that's the case because there are building owners that no longer exist, that's gone bankrupt, there are shell companies overseas. That's the world that we're dealing with. This is complex and multifaceted. It is not simple. In those situations, buildings above 18 metres where the greatest risk lies will take advantage of the new scheme, and no leaseholder in that situation will have to pay for the remediation of unsafe cladding. Below 18 metres where the risk is significantly lower, guided by our expert opinion, the financing arrangements will be in place. This is a comprehensive plan to provide comfort and reassurance, certainty and confidence to as many leaseholders as possible.
28 is withdrawn, so we go to Emma Lewell-Buck.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Yesterday it was revealed that the company who made the Grenfell Tower cladding shamefully, knowingly sold flammable materials to construction projects because it was around £4 cheaper than fire retardant cladding. It's taken the government all of these years to propose measures that will stop companies prioritising savings over life, in that they still haven't bothered to identify all of the buildings, including care homes and hospitals, that may have unsafe cladding. Why is that?
Well, the Honourable Lady is wrong. As a matter of fact, we moved swiftly. We set up the Grenfell inquiry, which has heard those shocking allegations. We brought forward the Judith Hackett review of building safety, which concluded that the regulatory regime needed to change. We've drafted and are now bringing forward the legislation to do that. And I hope, incidentally, that she and members opposite will vote for the fire safety bill, and the building safety bill when they come before this House soon, because that is the best way of creating the new regime, holding developers to services, and councils have the powers they need to take action against unsafe buildings. I too have been shocked by the allegations that I've heard at the inquiry, and that is why, as an interim step, before we hear the judge's recommendations, I've announced that we're going to create a new national regulator of construction products, and that I'm going to review the testing procedures for construction products which seem to be woefully inadequate.
Final question is to Bob Blackman.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I would like to thank my right honourable friend for listening to the representations that we made from the Select Committee and from other colleagues. People who live in high-rise buildings will be breathing a sigh of relief, I think, from his announcements today, and I would like to thank him for those. The people that live in medium-rise blocks, I think we need to reserve judgment to make sure we examine the details of his announcements today. Can I ask him specifically that the applications for the fund that he's previously been running, there are some 1,100 incomplete applications, many of which require survey work to be undertaken, and there is an issue about whether there's capacity to do that from the industry, and indeed whether that work will actually demonstrate what is needed. But more importantly than that, the cost of those surveys has to be borne by someone. So what is he doing about ensuring those surveys are carried out and indeed the applications then made complete to the fund so that work can continue on the buildings that are currently unsafe?
Well, can I thank the Honourable Gentleman, my Honourable Friend, for his support and advice in recent months, and that of all members of the Select Committee. With respect to the fund, we've received a large number of applications which, as he says, are incomplete. That reflects the fact that many building owners do not know as much as they should know about the materials on their buildings, and so a great deal of work needs to be done to assess those so they can now be funded, the work's contracted, and we get those workers on site to do the important building safety works as quickly as possible. There's a particular problem, which he alights on, with respect to the number of fully trained, competent assessors who can go out and do that important first step. We're working with the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors to dramatically increase the number of fully trained assessors. That work has started and the numbers are already increasing. And we're also working with the Treasury so that those individuals are not merely trained, but can get the professional indemnity insurance that they'll need to do the job. If we can bring those two things together, and that's happening quickly, then we'll be able to have a very significant increase in the number of individuals going out, doing the assessments, helping to give certainty to individuals and getting the works started.